it was a great movie, but
Yeah.
it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
Mel Gibson was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ.
It was one of the most talked about episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience in years. Not because of a fight, not because of politics, but because of a conversation about faith that turned unexpectedly personal. When Mel Gibson sat down across from Joe Rogan in January 2025, nobody expected the discussion to reveal just how much resistance, sacrifice, and conviction went into one of the most successful independent films ever made. By the end of it, Rogan wasn't just interviewing a filmmaker. He was listening to a man explain why he was willing to risk everything for a story he believed had to be told. The episode didn't open with controversy. It opened the way most Joe Rogan conversations do, loosely, without an agenda, touching on movies, culture, and the state of Hollywood. But didn't take long before the conversation drifted toward the subject that has defined so much of Gibson's career and reputation, the Passion of the Christ. And once Gibson started talking about what it actually took to get that film made, the tone in the room shifted completely. To understand why this conversation mattered, you have to go back more than 2 decades to a moment when nobody in Hollywood wanted to touch Gibson's idea. The Passion of the Christ wasn't pitched as a safe bet. It was a film about the final 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life, shot largely in Aramaic and Latin, with subtitles, an unknown commercial strategy, and a subject matter that studios considered radioactive. Gibson wasn't just proposing a religious drama. He was proposing something unflinching, something that refused to soften the violence or sanitize the suffering at the center of the Christian story. On the podcast, Gibson didn't dress up what that process was actually like. There was a lot of opposition to it, he told Rogan, matter-of-factly. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. He explained that whenever a filmmaker touches subject matter this significant, this personal to so many people, resistance is almost guaranteed. It's not a neutral topic. It's one of the most consequential stories in human history, and depending on who you ask, either sacred truth or myth, either transformative or offensive. Gibson knew that going in, and he made the film anyway. What Gibson wanted to capture wasn't just history. It was meaning. As he explained to Rogan, the entire theological idea behind the film was that everyone shares responsibility for what happened to Christ. Not one group, not one era, not one set of people 2,000 years ago, but all of humanity, across all of time. The idea was that we're all responsible for this, Gibson said, that his sacrifice was for all mankind, and that for all our ills and all the things in our fallen nature, it was a redemption. That single idea shaped every decision in the film, from the unflinching violence of the scourging scenes to the quiet, devastating moments between Jesus and his mother. Gibson wasn't interested in a distant, reverent retelling. He wanted audiences to feel the weight of the thing. That intention is part of why the film provoked such a strong reaction when it was released in 2004. Critics were sharply divided. Some praised its raw sincerity and visual ambition. Others were disturbed by its graphic violence, and religious scholars raised serious concerns before the film even hit theaters, worried that certain scenes could be read as reinforcing old and dangerous stereotypes that had historically been used to justify anti-Jewish violence. Gibson has consistently maintained that his intent was the opposite of that, to show universal culpability, not to single out any one group. But the debate around the film never fully went away, and it's part of why the movie remains as discussed today as it was more than 20 years ago. Despite the skepticism, and despite the fact that no major studio wanted to finance a film shot in dead languages about the crucifixion, the Passion of the Christ became a cultural phenomenon. It earned $370.8 million domestically and roughly $612 million worldwide against a production budget of only $30 million, making it the highest-grossing R-rated film in American history at the time. It proved something the industry hadn't accounted for. There was a massive audience hungry for exactly the kind of serious, unapologetic religious storytelling that executives assumed had no commercial future. During the Rogan conversation, Gibson also touched on something that goes beyond box office numbers or critical reception. He pointed out what he sees as an inconsistency in how Hollywood and popular culture treat different faiths. Other religious traditions, he suggested, tend to be approached with caution and respect, while Christianity is often treated as fair game for mockery or dismissal. Whether or not you agree with that assessment, it's clearly something Gibson has thought about deeply, shaped by decades of trying to get faith-based projects made in an industry that doesn't always know what to do with them. But the conversation wasn't purely about the past. It also revealed just how personal this project has remained for Gibson more than 20 years later. He didn't treat the topic like old news he was contractually obligated to promote. He spoke about it the way someone talks about something that still costs them something they're still emotionally invested in. That emotional weight became even more apparent when Gibson pivoted to the resurrection, the part of the Christian story he considers the hardest to accept and, in his view, the most important. He didn't try to explain it away or make it more palatable for a general audience. Instead, he leaned directly into how strange and demanding the claim actually is. Who gets back up 3 days later after he gets murdered in public? Gibson asked Rogan. Buddha didn't do that. It was a blunt way of making a point that Gibson clearly believes matters, that the resurrection isn't a comfortable, symbolic idea. It's either the most audacious claim in human history, or it's nothing at all. There's no comfortable middle ground, and Gibson said as much. He went further, connecting his personal conviction about the reliability of the Gospels to the fate of the apostles who wrote and spread them. His reasoning was simple. Every one of them, according to tradition, died rather than deny what they claimed to have witnessed. For Gibson, that's not a minor detail. People might lie for money, for power, or for status. But dying for a story you know to be false, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, is a different matter entirely. It's the kind of argument that has been made by Christian apologists for centuries, but hearing Gibson frame it so directly on a podcast with tens of millions of listeners gave it new reach. There was also a strange, almost surreal backdrop to the entire conversation that Gibson didn't shy away from mentioning. The interview took place while wildfires were tearing through Southern California, and Gibson, only half joking, referenced the fires and made a pointed comment about where he felt tax dollars should have gone instead. He later admitted in a separate interview that he was genuinely distracted during the podcast, uncertain whether his own neighborhood and his own home had survived the flames. It added a layer of real-world tension to a conversation that was already unusually raw for a celebrity podcast appearance, a reminder that even in the middle of talking about faith and eternity, Gibson was dealing with something immediate and uncertain in his own life. Then came the part of the conversation that generated the most attention afterward, Gibson's confirmation that he and longtime collaborator Randall Wallace, the screenwriter behind Braveheart and Hacksaw Ridge, have spent years developing a sequel focused on the resurrection. This wasn't a rumor Gibson was dodging. He leaned into it, describing a project that sounds almost nothing like a conventional sequel. According to Gibson, the idea for the film actually began years earlier, during a dinner conversation with Wallace while the two were working on Hacksaw Ridge. Wallace, who is Baptist, pointed out to Gibson, who is Catholic, that Catholic tradition tends to emphasize the crucifixion, the passion, while Protestant tradition places more weight on the empty cross, on the resurrection itself. That theological difference sparked something in Gibson. According to Wallace, Gibson went quiet for a moment, clearly turning the idea over in his head, before eventually deciding to pursue it. It's a small, human detail, two collaborators talking shop over dinner, that ended up shaping a project nearly a decade in the making. Gibson described the resulting screenplay, co-written with Wallace and his brother Donald Gibson over roughly 7 years, in strikingly unusual terms. He told Rogan that the story required starting all the way back at the fall of the angels, meaning the film moves into a different realm entirely before returning to the central story of the resurrection. He's called the script an acid trip, and has said he's never read anything like it. That's not typical language for a filmmaker describing a faith-based sequel, and it signals that whatever Gibson and Wallace have written goes far beyond a simple continuation of the original story. Reports indicate the project explores territory like hell, Sheol, and the origins of Satan, framing the resurrection not just as a historical event, but as the culmination of a much larger spiritual conflict. It's worth being clear about what is confirmed and what is a personal account here. Gibson and lead actor Jim Caviezel have both said, publicly and on multiple occasions, that unusual things happened during the filming of the first movie, including a claim that Caviezel was struck by lightning while on the cross and briefly died. These are stories the two men have told themselves, not independently documented events, and they should be understood as personal testimony rather than verified fact. Whatever actually happened on that set, it's clear both men walked away from the experience believing something significant took place beyond the ordinary demands of filmmaking, and that belief has clearly shaped how seriously they've approached the sequel. The sequel itself, titled The Resurrection of the Christ, has not had an entirely smooth path to the screen. It was originally expected to feature much of the original cast, but de-aging technology and scheduling proved complicated, since more than 20 years have passed since the first film, and the story is meant to take place just days after it. Eventually, the production made the decision to recast the film entirely. Jim Caviezel and Monica Bellucci exited the project, with Finnish actor Jaakko Otonen stepping into the role of Jesus and Mariella Garriga taking on the role of Mary Magdalene. Other roles were recast as well. It was a significant and for many longtime fans surprising shift for a project that had been associated with its original cast for so long. Filming ultimately wrapped in 2026, more than a decade after Wallace first pitched the idea to Gibson over dinner. What makes the Rogan conversation worth revisiting isn't a single shocking revelation. It's the cumulative picture it paints of a filmmaker who has spent more than 20 years wrestling with the same set of questions. What does it mean to say Christ's death and resurrection matter for everyone, not just believers? Why does this particular story provoke so much resistance? And is it possible to make something serious and unflinching about faith in an industry that often treats religious conviction as either kitsch or controversy? Gibson didn't arrive at easy answers on the podcast, and he didn't pretend to. He talked about opposition he faced, about a belief system he spent decades examining rather than simply inheriting, and about a new project he clearly considers the most ambitious and personally demanding thing he's ever attempted. Whether you find Gibson's arguments convincing or not, whether you see The Passion of the Christ as one of the most powerful religious films ever made, or as a deeply flawed and controversial project, the conversation with Rogan made one thing clear. Gibson isn't finished exploring these questions. 2 decades after risking his career and his own money to get the first film made, he's doing it again with a project even stranger, even more ambitious, and by his own description, unlike anything he's ever written. For an industry that once told him nobody wanted this story, Gibson's response, then and now, has been the same. He's telling it anyway. There are interviews that fill airtime, and then there are interviews that change how you see a piece of art forever. This is the story of one of the second kind. It happened on a podcast that had built its reputation on long, unscripted conversations hosted by a man named Dale Kessler, known for his blunt curiosity and his refusal to steer a guest towards safe territory. His guest that day was Victor Alaric, a filmmaker whose name had become inseparable from a single, staggeringly controversial movie he had made 20 years earlier, a film about the final hours of a condemned prophet's life. Nobody expected the conversation to go where it went. By the time it ended, Kessler wasn't performing curiosity anymore. He was sitting in stunned silence, listening to a man finally say out loud what he'd carried privately for 2 decades. The episode didn't begin with any of that. It began the way these conversations usually do, loosely, without an agenda, drifting between film craft, industry gossip, and the strange economics of independent cinema. Alaric was relaxed, funny even, telling stories about early jobs and disastrous auditions. But Kessler, sensing an opening, eventually steered things toward the film that had made Alaric both famous and, in certain rooms, radioactive. And once Alaric started talking about what it had actually taken to get that film made, something in his voice changed. To understand what Alaric revealed, you have to understand what that film actually was. It wasn't conceived as an easy sell. It depicted the last 12 hours in the life of a religious martyr, shot largely in a dead language with subtitles, built around suffering so unflinching that test audiences reportedly walked out in tears or nausea. No studio wanted to finance it. Alaric had shopped the script for years, watched executives nod politely, and then quietly pass, watched colleagues who had once championed his work grow distant and non-committal the moment the subject came up. Nobody wanted to be the person who greenlit it, Alaric told Kessler, and nobody wanted to be the person who publicly passed on it either. So mostly people just disappeared. He described phone calls that went unreturned for weeks, meetings that were quietly rescheduled into oblivion, a kind of institutional cold shoulder that never announced itself as rejection, but functioned as one anyway. What kept Alaric going, he explained, wasn't stubbornness alone. It was a conviction he'd carried since childhood that the story he wanted to tell wasn't really about one man's execution 2,000 years earlier. It was about complicity, about the idea that every generation, every ordinary person, carries some share of responsibility for cruelty and indifference towards suffering. The whole point, Alaric said, was that we don't get to watch this from a distance. We're not spectators. We're implicated. That idea shaped every brutal, lingering shot in the finished film, The Choice to Never.